When I was 13, I had a babysitter that would come once a week, as my mom would work late every Saturday night. I always thought I was too old to have a babysitter still, and hated having to have someone watch over me all the time. The main person my mom would have over was a 20-year-old guy, Thomas, that was the son of one of my mom's work friends. This guy was really weird and I didn't like him at all. He didn't talk much and just acted really awkward and strange. But whenever he interacted with my mom, he would act extra nice and talkative. I would bring it up with her, but she'd always say I was just trying to get rid of him so I could be alone. Anyways, it was a normal Saturday night and Thomas had just arrived a little late as usual. My mom talked with him for a little bit and then headed to work. I walked over to the couch and turned on my Xbox to play some video games just to pass the time. I'd usually go to bed at 10, so I'd have to spend 4 or 5 hours with Thomas. Most of the time, I'd find something to do alone because he'd never really talk to me and would just hang out in the kitchen or in our loft area. And today was no different. He stayed in the kitchen for a little bit, and after a few minutes I heard him talking to someone. I tried to listen as best I could, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. The kitchen was right behind the living room that I was in, but he was talking really quietly. He went on for a few minutes, and then the talking stopped, followed by him coming into the living room and standing next to the couch. I looked up at him and saw he was holding his phone. Thomas said someone was going to come over just for a second and not to worry. I didn't really know how to respond other than to just say, okay. It was pretty weird though, and I knew it was definitely not something any babysitter should do. But I also knew that there was nothing I could really do about it. The next 20 minutes were really awkward, as he didn't take out his phone or anything. He just sat there on the couch with me looking around and not saying anything. He would rarely ever be in the same room as me, so this was pretty out of the ordinary. Our living room was right by the front door though, so I guess he was just waiting for the person to get here. Eventually, a car pulled into the driveway and a man came knocking at the door. Thomas shot up and went over to the door, then stood right in front of it for a moment before turning to me and telling me that he'd be back in just a minute. Then he opened the door and walked outside and shut the door behind him. This whole situation had me curious as to what was going on with him. The blinds on the windows were cracked open just enough for me to see the two of their shadows as they moved around in the driveway. I could tell that the man handed Thomas a large bag and then got in his car and drove away. A few seconds later, I heard the lid of the garbage can outside slam shut, followed by Thomas coming back inside through the front door. The whole interaction seemed odd, and I couldn't help myself from asking him what it was all about. Thomas replied, telling me that it was just his friend and that he left his wallet at his friend's house last night, so he was just dropping it off. I could tell there was something wrong with the way he answered, and it didn't explain the large bag I saw him holding. But I didn't want to question him any further, so I just said, okay, and went back to playing my game. But things got a lot more strange as the night progressed. During the next hour, I could hear Thomas having multiple phone calls with someone in the kitchen, and at one point, he went into the far loft area where I could hear him raising his voice. Still though, I couldn't make any sense of what he was saying. After maybe the 5th or 6th call, the same car from earlier pulled into the driveway again, and Thomas immediately ran outside without saying anything. I could tell from their body language and the way that they were moving around that they were clearly arguing about something. Then Thomas left for 30 seconds and then came back with the bag from earlier. The man took it and put it in his back seat, then drove off in a hurry. Thomas came back inside and I could see the frustration on his face. He went over to the kitchen and didn't come back until 10 when he told me I had to go to bed. I got ready and laid in bed while Thomas stayed downstairs. He would usually stay until my mom got home at 12, but just a few minutes later, I heard the front door open and close. I waited for 10 minutes, then got up and went downstairs to see if he was still there. But sure enough, he had left. I looked out the window, and his car was gone too. I stayed up in bed for a few hours to wait for my mom to get home, and then told her everything that had happened. She seemed to believe me this time, as she also thought it was strange and really unprofessional to leave the house before she came home. The next day, she tried calling him, but he didn't answer. Eventually, though, she got a hold of her friend who was Thomas's mom and asked what happened. And she said that Thomas came home feeling sick. We both knew that was a lie and didn't make much sense, as he could have just called her and told her he wasn't feeling well. Anyways, it's been almost 10 years since all that happened, and I still find myself thinking, it's been almost 10 years since all that happened, and I still find myself thinking about how weird that night was. I worked as a babysitter during my college years, just to make some extra money without having to have a set work schedule. For the most part, I took care of this one family's 4-year-old boy a couple times a week, as the parents would often have dinner events for work. The boy was quiet, but I appreciated that because he was easy to watch over. He didn't do much besides watch TV and play with toys, and he seemed to like me. This was my 6th time watching after him. I had got to the house just before his parents left, and they explained that they would be back home around 11 tonight, and I needed to make sure that he was in bed by 9. The first few hours went as usual. I watched TV with him and made him a small frozen pizza. After finishing his food, he told me he had to use the bathroom and left for a few minutes. When he returned, he asked me about the shuffling noises coming from the basement. I was confused and immediately turned off the TV. Sure enough, as soon as the TV was quiet, I could clearly hear something moving around down there. It was very faint though, and I couldn't tell what it was. Seeing the boy was clearly scared, I assured him it would be okay and was probably just a small animal that had gotten in. I told him to wait up here while I go down to see what it was. By this point, the shuffling had already stopped. I'd never been in the basement of this house before, as it was unfinished and there was never any reason to go down there. So I was definitely being cautious. I opened the door and turned on the light by the stairs. Then I walked down quietly and turned the light on at the bottom of the stairs, to which lit up the whole room. It was a pretty big space, mostly filled with storage boxes. I walked around, checking behind a few boxes, but after not seeing or hearing anything else, I went back upstairs. The boy was waiting for me on the couch and shot up when he saw me. I told him everything was fine and nothing was down there, and gave him a big hug just to make him feel better. After a few minutes, we had already forgotten about the whole thing, and a couple hours later, it was getting close to 9 o'clock, and I started to get him ready for bed. We went upstairs to his room and I made sure he was ready, then said goodnight and went back downstairs. I sat on the couch for probably 40 minutes just scrolling through my phone before hearing shuffling from the basement again, but this time it was a lot louder. My heart stopped for a second as I listened. Then I heard the bedroom door open upstairs and the boy call out my name. I told him to stay where he was and not to come down. I got up and made my way to the basement door. At this point, I was pretty terrified. I pulled out my phone and had it ready to call 911 as I opened the door as quietly as possible. The shuffling sounded like it was close to the bottom of the stairs. Now I reached over and flicked on the lights. Immediately, I slammed the door shut and ran upstairs to get the boy, then went straight out the front door and called 911. I stood across the street from the house looking at the windows as I waited for the cops to come. I also called the parents to let them know what had happened and to come home as soon as they could. When the police finally arrived, I told them what happened. As I turned on the lights by the stairs, I saw a half-naked man crouching down by the bottom while searching through a storage box. They carefully searched the home and found clear evidence of someone having lived in the basement recently, with piles of trash shoved in boxes, but they didn't find anyone. When the parents arrived, they thanked me for calling them and talked to the police about the situation. About an hour later, I was able to go home as they secured the house and filed the reports. I spent the next few days really shaken up and being pretty paranoid. For a couple of weeks, I kept in touch with the parents to see if there were any updates on the man, but nothing ever came up. Eventually, we lost touch as I no longer wanted to babysit anymore. I babysit as a part-time job. I worked for a few different sites before I settled for Sitter City. This specific babysitting site allowed me to work the random hours that I wanted and not have to worry about being able to babysit on a set schedule every week. On a Saturday morning, I got a job from a family requesting me to babysit their 2 kids from 8 p.m. to 1 a.m. I worked mid-shift at my regular job that day, so this still worked for my schedule. Also, These late-night jobs are always the best because the kids usually go to bed between 9 and 10, so I'm left to just relax until the parents get home. I accepted the job, and that night I drove over and met the parents 10 minutes early. They introduced the kids, who were both very young boys, I think 5 and 6 years old. They told me to just make sure that they were in bed by 9:30, then they left. The two boys were both pretty shy and watched cartoons for most of the time. I'd say half of the kids I meet are just like this, though. At 9:30, I turned off the TV and got them in bed without any problems, then went downstairs and sat on the couch. I had 3.5 hours to myself before the parents got back. I brought headphones to prepare for this and put them in and started watching YouTube on my phone. I was tired, so I needed something to keep me busy so that I wouldn't fall asleep. Like I said, these late jobs are the best because it doesn't feel like you're even babysitting. But the hardest part of it is not falling asleep. By 11, I was really pushing myself to keep my eyes open. Watching videos on my phone was starting to make me even more sleepy, so I put my phone down and got up. I walked into the kitchen to pour myself a cup of water, then stood by the table while I sipped on it, hoping to wake myself up some more. Then I heard a voice. It was one of the boys upstairs calling for me. I put my water down and walked quickly up the stairs and into his room. It was the older of the two. He was sitting up in his bed and looked really scared. "You okay?" I asked, sitting on the edge of his bed. He said in between his cries that he heard someone walking outside his room. I told him that it was okay and that nobody else was here, then tucked him back in. The other boy was in bed on the other side of the room, sleeping still, so I backed out of the room and closed the door quietly. I stuck my head into each of the rooms upstairs, making sure they were empty, then went back downstairs. I was sure the boy just had a nightmare. I got my cup of water and sat on the couch again. I was more awake now, so I guess that was a good thing. But then I heard it. Someone walking through the hallway upstairs. It sounded slow and careful, like they were trying to be quiet. I was terrified, but I had to keep the boys safe. I ran upstairs, but nobody was in the hallway. Then I opened the boys' room, and both of them were still asleep. I checked each of the rooms again, then went back downstairs. I was tired and figured my mind was playing tricks on me. This time I took my phone out to keep me busy. Maybe a minute passed, when suddenly there were footsteps sprinting down the hallway upstairs. I ran upstairs, seeing nobody again, but this time when I opened the boys' room, they were both sitting up in bed, looking terrified. I got both of them downstairs and into my car outside. I locked the car doors, then called the police and the parents. Both of the boys said they heard running footsteps outside their door, so I knew I wasn't just hearing things. When police came, they searched everywhere but found no one. They didn't even find any signs of someone ever having broken in or staying anywhere inside. I don't know who or what we heard, but I know there was someone else upstairs. I never went back to their house to babysit again,